Macro and portrait photographers, you are just so lucky. I just got a new lens for you, and this is the brand new Pergear 60mm f2.8 macro with 2:1 ratio for Micro Four Thirds. As you know, I've started reviewing Pergear lenses just over a year ago. I've always considered them to be one of the best budget lens manufacturers around. Its performance against cost is often the driving force for my recommendations. Today, I have this, the latest macro offering from them. Just to let you know, the copy I have here is actually a prototype, so the retail version may be a little bit different to what you see here. With that said, the optical performance should be final. And I would like to thank Pergear for letting me test your lens before release too. Cheers, buddy. One thing you may not know is that there are a lot of macro lenses in the Micro Four Thirds platform. The most popular option has to be the Olympus MFT 60mm 2.8 with a 1:1 reproduction ratio, which is one of the most optically perfect lenses in this category. But more than that, it's light, compact, and weather sealed. But over the years, many have joined the party. Even Olympus has introduced a smaller brother, the 30mm 3.5 macro, that has a best-in-class 1.25:1 reproduction ratio. But none has achieved greater magnification until Laowa's famous 50mm 2.8, which has a 2:1 reproduction ratio, allowing you to see all the parasites on your nose hair. The reason I bring this up is that Pergear's new 60mm 2.8 macro is also a 2:1. With a longer focal length, you can get even larger magnification than Laowa's offering. But how does it perform? As a tradition, first I would like to have a look at the build quality of this new macro lens. And also a tradition, like other Pergear lenses I've reviewed so far, the entire lens is constructed in metal. And yes, I really can't find any plastic bits anywhere in and around the lens, which is pretty impressive. Both the focus and aperture rings are smooth like KFC grease, but I do find that the focus ring is a little on the stiff side, but it could just be my prototype. And all of you video peeps out there would love to hear that the aperture ring is clickless, so you get that stepless adjustment if you use this lens for some close-up detail shots. The focus mechanism is internal, so the lens doesn't change in length during focusing, which is pretty nice. But if I have to be critical, the one thing I'm still puzzling is the front of the lens. It's completely exposed. Right, I'm trying to focus it for you. Right, can you see that? Look at that. It's completely exposed. Right, I've rarely seen lenses like this. So while the rest of the lens is pretty tight, bees can build a nest through the front of the lens, and they are going to like it because it's metal, so it's cool during hot summer days. So the solution is to invest in a 62mm UV filter to close the mouth of the lens so bugs won't go inside. Aligned with other Pergear lenses I've tested so far, the marking on the lens are printed and not engraved. Whether it's a brand identity or not, it tells you that this lens is made for people with smaller budget. Aside from being not weather sealed, the Pergear 60mm macro is built like a time capsule that can stand the test of time. Although metal really hurts the handling for us Micro Four Thirds users, the Pergear 60mm 2.8 is heavy. At 600 grams, it weighs twice as much as any pen and OMD cameras, apart from EM1 series. It's also large too, with a diameter of 68mm and 118mm long. It resembles more of a lens for SLR than a mirrorless camera, which is quite a contrast to every Pergear lenses I reviewed so far. With this sort of size and weight, it is best to use it on a larger camera or one with bigger grip to counter that balance. So if you already use a bigger setup like the EM1X, then you're totally fine. In fact, it looks pretty professional. Overall, I would say handling is great if you're a bigger person, using larger setup or setting macro on tripods. Well, but not so much if you're a smaller person and using more compact setup. Pergear 60mm 2.8 is a macro lens with a 2:1 magnification. The lens is pretty simple. With 10 elements in 7 groups, it should be able to resolve details. So let's investigate this together. First, distortion is never a problem for any medium tele lens, macro or not. Pergear is no exception. There is no visible distortion I notice when shooting my lovely brick wall. And second, vignette is very minor too. Yes, it exists when shooting wide open at 2.8, but barely noticeable in real life situation. But if you're worried, it's all gone by f4. And now, sharpness. Of course, this is important. You are buying a macro lens at the end of the day, so it needs to have that power to resolve details on whatever you're capturing. As you can see, central sharpness is excellent even at wide open 2.8, and things get better as you stop down. Peak sharpness is achieved at 5.6 and holds the resolution until f11, which is pretty impressive, before eventually going soft at f16 due to diffraction. Corners are slightly behind, but only just. It shows a bit of softness at 2.8 and sharpens up nicely by f4. Then everything is pin sharp at 5.6. Flare is well controlled too, even without a hood. But I'll still strongly recommend getting one to protect the exposed front element, like I said before, if you don't intend to use a filter. So overall, Pergear 60mm 2.8 produces excellent and sharp images across its aperture range. For those who are not familiar with macro ratios, 1:1 is usually referred to life-size reproduction. So if you're photographing an object that's the size of a micro four thirds sensor, you can basically fill the entire frame with it. So a 2:1 means that you can get twice as close or 2 times the magnification as the 1:1 ratio. And this is huge for those who want to get closer to those tiny little subjects without any extension tubes. For everyone who enjoys a bit of tonne, I'm pleased to say that the Pergear 60 2.8 produced some very pleasing bokeh. Okay, it's not feather bokeh quality, but it's very smooth and creamy. As you can see, with 10 aperture blade, the bokeh ball remains very round in all aperture settings. The smoothest bokeh achieved between wide open at f2.8 until f8. Then the balls turn to onion rings between f11 and f16. For most macro photographers, you may want to stick with 5.6 and 6.3 if you need depth of field, and focus stack in post if necessary, and try to avoid the smallest aperture settings. But overall, I'm very impressed with Pergear's first crack at macro design. One thing I haven't mentioned is price. Pergear is known to be a budget brand. So far, all the lenses I've tested so far definitely reflect that. While some performs better than others, this 60mm macro is definitely one of the best I've reviewed from Pergear. Oh yes, price. Pergear told me the launch price of this macro is only $229, which to me is a bargain for what it is. Because of the price, I'm not even bothered trying to compare it to other premium brands, including my favorite Olympus 60mm 2.8 macro and Laowa's 50mm 2.8 macro, with the latter having the same 2:1 magnification. Pergear may not have the ultimate sharpness of other more expensive options, but at this price, you can't argue it's bang for buck performance. So if you're a macro beginner, someone with limited budget, or an occasional close-up photographer, you can't really go wrong with this lens. That, of course, if you can get past its ginormous physique and sumo weight, and happy to use manual focus, which many macro photographers would do anyway. So there you go, it deserves a recommendation indeed. And last but not least, I would like to thank Pergear once again for sending me a prototype lens to test, and to make a video about it. Now, are you a macro guy? What do you think about this Pergear 60mm 2.8 macro? Are you planning to get a macro lens anytime soon? And what do you shoot mostly? Let's have a chat below. Cool, you know what to do now. Thumb if you enjoyed this video and sub if you want to stay in touch with all things Micro Four Thirds. And of course, Olympus. Peace! camera side. Look at that, man. I'm so pro. So pro, man. I'm pro. Look at that, pro. Street Fighters. Street Fighters. Who plays Street Fighter anyway? Those who born in the 80s. Yeah. And 70s. Yep. We all play Street Fighters, right? You know, it's the best game ever. It's got like a big hole. Like a big hole in there. Like a big hole. Look at that. You can see that. Look at that, crazy, isn't it? Oh, that's the lens.